My key didn't turn. I stood on my father's porch in late May with a grocery bag on my hip and a key I'd carried 19 years, and the lock simply held. Tessa picked up on the second ring. My sister told me, in that calm front desk voice of hers, that there was no spare for me, not yet. Dad was 82, 6 weeks into rehabilitation after a broken hip, and already talking about coming home. Someone had to clear his hallway and move his bed downstairs before discharge. That someone had always been me. In the bag of belongings the hospital returned with his coat, I found a folded invoice. A locksmith. 2 addresses on 1 work order. His house on Alder Street, and an address I had never seen in my life. Ordered the 4th of May. 11 days before he fell. Then I read the payment line, and the theory I'd built in 90 seconds came apart. The card was his. The signature was his. I called the locksmith. Genuine work order, completed, both houses, same morning. Tessa gave me 1 sentence. Dad ordered both. He asked her not to explain until his belongings were secure. I was still holding that invoice when I remembered the 2 spare keys I gave my son during his divorce, and never asked back. The hardware was what I noticed first, before any of the rest of it. Bright brass on a door my father had painted the same shade of green 3 times since I was in high school. The screws were new. The strike plate was new. There was a clean rectangle in the weathered paint where the old plate had sat for 40 years, pale as skin under a watch band. I walked around to the garage. He kept his shop in there, and the side door had a padlock on it now, a heavy one, the shackle still shiny. Dad's old padlock had been a rusted thing you could open by looking at it wrong, so somebody had been thorough. The bag of his belongings had been in my trunk since they moved him from the hospital over to the rehabilitation center on Chestnut. A nurse handed it to me in the hallway while an aide was strapping his chart to the gurney, and I said thank you and set it in the car and forgot about it, the way you forget things during a week like that. It smelled like the hospital when I opened it. His coat, a receipt for a fan belt, half a roll of peppermints, and the invoice, folded in quarters, soft along the creases like it had been opened and refolded a number of times. Cascade lock and key, 1 work order, 2 job numbers, 2 service addresses, his and a bungalow on Juniper Lane. I've spent 26 years reviewing insurance claims. What that job teaches you is that 5 different names can sit on 1 page and mean 5 different things. The person who requests the work is not always the person who pays. The person who pays is not always the person who owns. The address where the work happens is not always where anybody lives. Most of the mistakes I catch are people confusing those lines, and most of the fraud I catch is somebody counting on me to confuse them too. So I read the invoice the way I'd read a file. Requested by, and there was Tessa's name and her cell number. Authorized and paid, and there was my father. His card. His signature. That cramped block printing he'd used on shop drawings his whole life, the M like a little sawhorse. Ordered the 4th of May. Work completed the 7th. He fell on the 15th. I sat down on the step with the groceries going warm beside me and called the number at the top of the page. A woman answered on the 4th ring, over the sound of a key machine. I read her the work order number. She said, yes, that's ours. Both jobs, closed out and billed the same day. I asked whether there was a second address on it. She said, ma'am, I can't go through a customer's account with you, but I'm not telling you anything you don't have in your hand. Which was an answer. The second house was real. The paper was real. Whatever else was wrong here, nobody had invented that bungalow. I put the milk in the neighbor's refrigerator and drove downtown to the hotel where Tessa manages the front desk. She came out to the loading side by the luggage cart so we wouldn't do it in the lobby. 57 years old, cardigan, name tag, that flat pleasant expression she can hold through anything. She has worked the desk since she was 22. People have thrown room keys at her. I held up the invoice. She didn't reach for it. I said, you rekeyed Dad's house. She said, I made the appointment. I didn't order it. I said, then who did? And she looked past me at the river for a second, and she said, both of those old keys had to stop working on the same morning. That was the whole point of doing it that way. That's all you're getting from me until his things are somewhere safe. She went back inside. The automatic door made its little sigh behind her. I drove home with the invoice on the passenger seat and did what I always do when a file doesn't sit right, which is stop guessing and start proving. The first thing to prove was the money. If Tessa had put $465 of locksmith work on my father's card while he was unconscious in a trauma bay, that was a different story than the one she was telling, and it was a story with a clear shape to it. I have reviewed that story 100 times. The daughter with the access, the parent who can't speak for himself, the paperwork that gets tidy right after the ambulance leaves. So I went and got his mail. I'd been collecting it since the fall, which everybody knew and nobody had written down anywhere, and that bothered me too. Now that I was noticing things. The box is at the curb. The box has its own little key. And mine still worked, because nobody had thought to change that. 2 weeks of circulars, a water bill, and the card statement. I sat at my kitchen table with a highlighter and went through it line by line. There it was. The 7th of May. Cascade lock and key, $465, posted the 9th. No dispute filed. No second charge, no split payment. Nothing routed through anyone else. And above it, on the 4th, a charge to the same merchant for a deposit, which is how they take a two-property job. The dates lined up with the paper. The paper lined up with the signature. If my sister had forged this, she'd have had to forge it 3 separate times in 3 separate systems, and Tessa is a woman who alphabetizes her spice rack, not a woman who runs a scheme. I looked at that highlighted line for a long time and felt the ground tilt, because if it was true, then my father had ordered the locks changed on his own house 11 days before he fell, and had chosen not to tell me, and had asked my sister to make the calls instead of me. That was the part I couldn't file anywhere. Not the money. The choosing. I drove to the rehabilitation center on Chestnut the next afternoon with the statement in my purse. He was in the chair by the window with his walker parked at an angle he was clearly going to be told about, and he looked smaller than he had in April. 82 years old and still with those hands, thick through the knuckles, a cabinet maker's hands, a half-moon scar on the left thumb from a jointer in 1968. I didn't lead with it. I asked about the physical therapy, and he said the girl was a tyrant and he liked her. I peeled him an orange. Then I put the statement on the tray table and asked him about the 7th of May. He looked at it. He didn't look surprised, and he didn't look caught. He just looked tired in a specific way, like a man who'd been hoping for a few more weeks. He said, "That's mine." I said, "Both houses." He said, "Both houses." I asked him why, and he said, "I'll explain it when I'm home." I said that wasn't good enough, that I couldn't get in to move his bed, that Tessa was talking in riddles at me next to a luggage cart, and he said, "June, I need you to let it be for a little while." Then he told me the planner was in the drawer. He keeps a pocket planner, the same cheap black kind he's bought at the drugstore every December for as long as I can remember, and it had come to the rehab center in his coat and gone into the nightstand. He told me to look at it myself instead of asking him. And there was something in that, an old man handing over the evidence rather than the explanation. I opened it to the 1st week of May. The 4th. Cascade. Both job numbers written out in that block print, one under the other, with a line drawn to join them like a bracket on a cut list. The 7th. The word done, and a check mark. And under the 7th, in the same pen, 4 words that I read maybe 6 times before they registered. 60 days. No new keys. The county puts property records on the internet, which most people don't know, and which I use about twice a month at work. I made coffee I didn't drink, and typed the Juniper Lane address into the assessor's search, the way I'd type a claimant's address on a Tuesday. It took 9 seconds. Parcel number, lot size, year built, 1941. Assessed value. Owner of record. Kata. May E. Deed recorded 1994. 32 years in one name, no transfers, no liens, no second party anywhere on it. Not my father. Not my sister. Nobody named Mercer had ever owned 1 square foot of that lot. And I sat back in my chair, because I knew that name. May Carter sent us Christmas cards with a wren on them. She'd taught 4th grade. My father built her kitchen cabinets sometime in the 80s for what I'm certain was not enough money. And when my mother died, May came to the house every day for a week and washed things that were already clean. In our family, she wasn't a friend so much as a fixture. Nobody said her first name. They said the Carter place. I had never once looked at the street it was on. The tax notices went to a mailing address in Bend, care of a daughter, which told me she wasn't living there right now. There's a whole category of claim that starts exactly that way. An empty house with the utilities on and somebody else's paperwork attached to it. I drove over that afternoon. Juniper Lane is 8 blocks of small houses with big trees. the kind of street where the sidewalks buckle. Hers was blue, or had been. Deep front porch. A rhododendron somebody had pruned hard and correctly, which is not how a stranger prunes. The lawn had been cut not long ago. No papers piling up. No flyers wedged in the door. Somebody was tending it, and tending it quietly. The deadbolt was new. Same brass, same brand, same maddening shine as the one on my father's front door. Whoever did one had done both, in the same hour, out of the same van. I did not have any business on that porch. I want to be honest about that. I was a woman looking in a stranger's window, and I told myself I was verifying an address, and I looked anyway. The curtain didn't quite meet in the middle. Inside was a front room with the furniture pushed back against the wall, and boxes stacked 3 high in the middle of the floor, taped and squared off like a man who knows how to load a truck had done it. The top box had a shipping label on it, the paper kind, with a name in black marker. Merced. I stood there with my hand still flat against the glass, and I thought about a Wednesday 3 years ago in February, my son on my couch close to midnight with his whole marriage in 2 duffel bags, and me driving out to my father's workshop while Evan slept, and taking a key off the board by the door. Dad kept his keyboard there for 40 years. Little brass hooks, cardboard tags in his handwriting. House, shop, truck, church basement. And one down at the end, worn soft at the corners, that said Carter. I took it off the hook. I didn't ask my father. I told myself I'd tell him in the morning, and I did tell him, sort of, in the way you tell somebody a thing after it's already done. I gave my son 2 keys that were not mine to give, and then I went back to work, and the crisis passed the way they always did, and I never asked for either one of them back. May Carter came home that Friday. She called me Thursday night from her daughter's kitchen in Bend, television going in the background, because I'd left a note wedged in her screen door with my number on it. She said, "Well, June Mercer." It had been 11 years since I'd heard her voice. We met on her porch. 80 years old, 4'11" in shoes, a shoulder that had been rebuilt in October and still didn't like the seatbelt. She had a folder with her. Not because I asked. Because she is a retired schoolteacher and that is how they are. She'd had it all copied at the drugstore. A letter she signed the 8th of October, giving Harold Mercer authority to hold keys to the property, to enter and inspect it, to arrange for repairs, and, in a clause somebody had thought about, to change the locks at his discretion while she was away. Her signature. Her daughter's signature underneath as witness. A phone number for the daughter in case anyone ever needed to check. I read it twice on her porch swing while she waited, and something in my chest that had been braced for 6 days let go about 1/4 of an inch. My sister hadn't taken anything. My father hadn't hidden a house. There was no house to hide. There was an 80-year-old woman in Bend with a bad shoulder who'd asked an old friend to look after her place, and had put it in writing, because that's what careful people do. Then I asked her about the boxes. May looked out at the street for a second, the way Tessa had looked at the river, and I understood that I was about to be the last person in this to find out. She said, "Harold called me in November. He said Evan was between places." She said she'd told him yes, of course, the back bedroom, the boy can stay. And then she said the sentence, "I've turned over more times than any other from that whole spring." I said until the end of February. I wrote February on my kitchen calendar before I hung up the phone. February came. February went. She was in Bend and she wasn't going to drive 200 miles to knock on her own door, and Harold kept saying he was handling it. And she trusted Harold, and she let it go from March into April the way you let things go when the alternative is a scene. I asked when Evan actually moved out. She said, "That's the thing. Harold told me in April that it was settled." Then she stood up, and she said, "Come look at the garage, and I'll show you what I noticed." The garage smelled like cold concrete and old sawdust. Shelves along the back, and a bench my father had built for her out of scrap fur, and on the shelf above the bench, a row of clean rectangles in the dust. She said, "He kept some of his tools out here last year while he was building me the closet shelves. He came back and forth for them." And she pointed at one of the rectangles. And she said, "That one had the wooden box." I asked what was in it. She said, "I don't know a plane from a pancake griddle, dear." But he opened it once to show me. He said it was the only tool he'd ever bought new. Tessa let me into the workshop on Sunday. She had the new key, and she stood in the doorway while I went in, and she didn't help me look, and she didn't leave either. I'd expected chaos. Dad's shop is the opposite of chaos. There's a card file on the wall by the window, a green metal box the size of a bread loaf, and in it is a card for every tool he owns. Model number, where he bought it, what he paid, and the year. He started it when he went out on his own in 1971. He wasn't sentimental about it, he was insured. That box was his schedule of property, and I'd never once thought about the fact that my father had, in his own way, been doing my job in that garage for 50 years. We went through it together, sort of. I read the cards out loud over the phone to him that evening with the box open on his workbench, and he told me which shelf, and I told him what was on it. 2 cards didn't match the shelves. The first was the low-angle jack, the Stanley, the number 62, the one in the wooden box out at May's. On the back, in pencil, in his block print, a note and a date in March. The second was a smoother he'd bought at an estate sale in Portland in 1988, a heavy infill thing with a rosewood handle, which had lived on the second shelf of his own shop, 11 feet from where I was standing. On the back, a note and a date in April. Different months, different buildings. Both before the 15th of May. I said, out loud into the phone, that they could have been loaned out, that he could have set them somewhere, that somebody could have come to do the water heater. My father let me finish. Then he said, June. I wrote the dates down when I noticed. I'm 82, I'm not confused, and I don't lend that plane. I stood in his shop with the phone against my ear and the smell of his life all around me, cut fur and machine oil and the ghost of the pipe he quit in 96, and I went back to the first card, the one for the 62, because I'd felt something stiff behind it when I set it down. There was a receipt clipped to the back. Fenwick Consignment, on Willamette. A single line item, handwritten, with a model number on it. The number 62. My son didn't answer his phone for 2 days, which is his way of negotiating. I found him Tuesday evening in the lot behind the distribution center off Bethel, sitting sideways in the driver's seat of his car with the door open and his feet on the asphalt, eating a sandwich out of the wrapper. 34 years old. He had his father's shoulders and my mother's mouth, and there was a laundry basket of clothes on the back seat that I made myself not look at twice. He said, "Hey, Mom," like it was Sunday. I put the invoice on the roof of the car. I'd stopped bringing my questions gift wrapped somewhere around the second week. I said, "Tell me about Juniper Lane." He chewed for a while. Then he said, "Grandpa knew I was there." "That's not a secret. He set the whole thing up." I said, "Until the end of February." And Evan said, "Nobody ever said February to me." Which might even have been true, the way a thing can be true and still be a lie about who did the not saying. May told Harold February. Harold told Evan he had the room for a while. Somewhere in that chain a date turned into a feeling, and everybody involved let it, because none of us has ever been able to stand the sentence "you need to leave now." I asked him when he moved out. He said, "April, mostly." Mostly. That's the word he used. He said the rest of it fast, the way he does when he's decided to be reasonable at me, that May wasn't using the house, that it sat empty for 11 months of the year with the heat on, that he had a job starting in June, a real one, dispatch, and he'd be back on his feet, and that he'd never taken one thing from that house, not so much as a fork. I asked if he still had the key. He looked at me then. 22 years of parent-teacher conferences in that look. He said, "You gave me those keys." He said 3 years ago, in your kitchen, at midnight, and you said, "Take these and don't make a whole thing out of it." And nobody ever asked me for them back. Not once, Mom. Not you, not Grandpa. 3 years. I said that a key isn't a deed. He said, "It isn't a stranger's house either." We stood there in the sodium light while a forklift beeped somewhere behind the building. Then I asked him about the garage and the wooden box on the shelf above the bench. The chewing stopped. He said there was a bunch of old stuff out there, and he never went through it, and if something walked off, that garage hadn't had a real lock on it since the Clinton administration, and half the neighborhood knew. I said, "And Grandpa's shop?" And he sat up straight and said, "No." Flat. No hesitation at all. He said, "I have never taken anything out of Grandpa's shop, and I'll say that to his face, and you can watch me." I believed him. That's the part I'd like to skip. Standing in that parking lot, I believed my son completely, because he said it fast and he said it clean, and because I wanted to. Then he crumpled the wrapper and said the thing he'd been building toward the whole time. He said, "You should ask yourself why Aunt Tessa's the one with all the new keys." He said, "Ask her why Grandpa's suddenly so worried about some old woman's bungalow, and why the two of them are running errands together, and why you didn't find out about any of it until a piece of paper fell out of a coat. He said, "They've been talking about you." Not me. You. I drove to my sister's house that night with my hands at 10 and 2 like a student driver. Tessa's kitchen has a chalkboard by the phone with the grandkids' practice schedules on it. She poured tea I didn't want and sat down across from me and folded her hands, and I asked her, straight, what she was keeping from me. She said, "One thing, and it isn't about you." I asked if she thought that was an answer. She said, "I promised Dad, not about the house, about Evan. And I want to be fair to myself here, so I'll say exactly what I did. I took Evan's sentence out of my pocket and I used it. I asked her when she'd decided she was the responsible daughter. I asked whether it felt good having the keys. I said that our father had had a serious accident 11 days after she started making arrangements for him, and that from where I was sitting a person could build a story out of that. My sister went white and then very still. She said, "June, get out of my house." At the door she said one more thing, and I don't think she meant to. She said, "Everything of his is safe. It's paid for through the 60 days. Nobody is throwing anything away." I said, "Everything of whose?" And she shut the door. The mail was still coming to Alder Street, and I was still the one picking it up, and on Thursday there was a windowed envelope from Riverbend Storage out on the highway. It was a renewal notice, which meant there was something to renew. Unit 117. 10 by 10. Prepaid 60 days, $420 cash. Renter, Harold Mercer. Access code on file for the renter only. And a start date, the 7th of May. The same morning, 2 locksmiths in the same van had changed 2 locks on 2 houses 11 miles apart. My father had driven out to Highway 99 and rented a room the size of a bedroom and paid for exactly 60 days. 60 days. No new keys. He was ready for me when I came in on Friday. I could tell by the way he had the chair turned toward the door. I set the storage notice on the tray table next to the water pitcher, and I didn't say anything at all, which is a technique I learned from him. He read it. Then he said, "All right." He said, "I was going to do this at the house." He said, "I had it planned out, and then I went and broke my hip like a damn fool, and now it's going to happen in a room that smells like disinfectant." I said, "I need you to let me look at things." And he said, "Yes. That's all. Yes." After 5 weeks of "not now and I'll explain later" one word, and I understood that he'd been waiting for me to ask for the file instead of the story. He is not a man who explains. He's a man who hands you the drawing. He told me the clipboard was hanging on the nail by the keyboard in the shop, and that Tessa would let me in, and that I should call him when I'd read the whole thing and not before. The clipboard had 4 pages on it. It was a job list. That's the only way to describe it. My father planned a kitchen install the same way, and I'd seen 100 of them growing up. The tasks in order. The ones that have to happen before other ones can. Boxes down the left margin. At the top, in his block print, the date he started it. The 29th of April. Call May. Get it in writing. Box checked. Cascade. Both addresses. Same morning, not separate days. Box checked, with the 2 job numbers written in beside it. Tell Tessa what, and not why. Box checked. Buy boxes and tape. 20 boxes. Checked. Rent unit, 60 days, pay cash. Checked. And then the line that made me sit down on the edge of his workbench with the clipboard in both hands. Ease things. Pack it all. Do not throw anything out. Not one thing. Not silver. Not deeds. Not whatever a person imagines when a house goes quiet and the paperwork starts moving. 20 boxes and a rented room for my son's clothes and his books and his tools and whatever else a man leaves behind in a house he was never supposed to be living in. There was nothing in those 4 pages about wills. Nothing about the house on Alder Street. Nothing about who gets what. I had spent 5 weeks reading this family like a claim file, looking for the transfer, and there wasn't one. There had never been one. Loads 1 through 3 had check marks and dates. The 8th of May. The 9th. The 12th. The last line on the page did not have a check mark. Load 4. Juniper Lane. Garage and back bedroom. And beside it, in pencil, the date he'd planned to do it. The 15th of May. Morning. Fenwick Consignment sits between a barber and a place that sells vacuum bags, and it smells like other people's attics. I brought the receipt in with me and asked the young man behind the counter if he could tell me anything about it. I expected to be told no. I get told no for a living, and I have made my peace with it." He looked at it for maybe 4 seconds and said, "Oh sure, that's a sale to a customer, not a payout to a consignor." I said, "Say that again." He turned the slip around and put his finger on the line. He said, "When we pay a consignor, it prints out on our other form. This one's a register receipt. Somebody bought this." The name on the buyer line was Harold Mercer. The date was the 22nd of April. My father had walked into a consignment shop on Willamette 3 weeks before he broke his hip and bought back his own plane. I stood there with my hand flat on that glass counter, and the young man, who was being kind and who had no idea what he was standing in the middle of, said, "That piece was in the case a while. Came in on consignment back in March." I asked, and he wouldn't tell me who brought it in, which is exactly right, and I told him so. Then I described the other one. The heavy one. Rosewood handle. An old English thing. I said I didn't suppose they'd had anything like that. He got a look on his face. The look of a person who's about to be helpful in a way he hasn't thought all the way through, and he said, "Yeah, that sold in May. Same account as the other one, actually." That's why I remember. Same account. I said thank you, and I went out and sat in my car in front of the vacuum bag store for a while. Here's the thing I still hate. I had the second piece already. I'd had it since the night it happened, in the side pocket of my work bag, where I put paperwork so I don't lose it. The emergency department gives you a packet. Face sheet on top. Name, date of birth, arrival time, mechanism of injury, and a line most people never read, because most people aren't looking for a line to sue somebody over. Incident location. 5 weeks. My sister had called me at 10:40 in the morning and said Dad fell, and I had driven to the hospital, and I had sat in that packet of paperwork for 2 hours, and I had assumed, because you assume, that an 82-year-old man falls in the house he's lived in since 1979. I ask strangers this question every single working day. Where did it happen? It is the first question on the form. I never asked it about my own father. The address on the face sheet was on Juniper Lane. The 15th of May. 9:50 in the morning. Load 4. Garage and back bedroom. I was still in that parking spot when my phone buzzed. It was Tessa, and it was the first thing she'd said to me since she'd told me to get out of her house. "Dad's coming home Thursday. He wants everyone at the storage place Saturday morning. All of us. May 2. He says bring Evan." Unit 117 was at the far end of the second row, past the place where the pavement gives up and turns to gravel. Riverbend storage on a Saturday morning in early July. Heat coming up off the asphalt already at 9. My father in a folding chair somebody had set out for him, Walker at his knee wearing a collared shirt, because of course he was. May in the shade with her purse in her lap. Tessa standing to one side with a clipboard, because Dad had asked her to write things down. And my son who came, which I will always give him, 20 minutes late and parked facing the exit. Dad had Tessa roll the door up. Boxes. Squared off. 3 high. A walkway down the middle. Every one of them labeled in that block print. Kitchen, back bedroom, closet, tools, papers, photos, and on every single box, in the corner, 2 letters. E. M. Dad said, "Everything in this room belongs to you. Nobody has been through it, and nobody's going to, except for one box I'm going to open in front of all of you, and I'll tell you when we get there." Then he told it, start to finish, in order, the way he'd have talked a customer through a set of drawings. He didn't raise his voice one time. He said, "In March I went out to Mays to get my 62 and it wasn't on the shelf." He said he told himself he'd moved it. He said he spent 2 weeks telling himself that, and then he wrote the date on the card, because writing it down is what you do when you've stopped believing yourself. He said he found it in April, in a glass case on Willamette with a tag on it. $1,100. He paid it. He didn't argue, and he didn't ask them to hold it, because he was afraid if he left the store it would be gone. Then he said, "That same week I called Evan and I told him the arrangement at Mays was finished." Not a hint. Finished. And he said all right. And then he said, "On the 27th of April, I went into my own shop and the smoother was gone off the second shelf. Nobody moved. The heat ticked in the metal roof." My father said, "The shop is on the same property as my bed. I sleep about 40 feet from that bench." He said he sat in the shop that night and thought it through, and what he thought was that a key doesn't know when it stops being welcome. That there were 2 houses, and one boy had a key to both, and if he changed one lock, the problem would just move to the other house, and if he changed them a week apart, the boy would have a week to decide what to do about the second one. So he called Cascade on the 4th of May and made them do both on the same morning. He said, "I didn't want to catch him. I wanted it to be over without a fight." He said he asked Tessa to make the calls because she works a front desk and can talk to a locksmith without her voice doing anything, and because if he'd asked me, I'd have called my son first and told him, and Dad said that last part with no cruelty in it at all, which is the only reason I could hear it. Tessa, standing there with her clipboard, said, "I told him it was a bad idea to keep you out of it, and he said he'd carry that." Dad said, "Then I had a different problem. If I lock a man out of 2 houses, everything he owns is on the wrong side of both doors. 20 boxes and a roll of tape. 60 days paid in cash because he didn't want a card renewing it forever on its own. 3 loads out of May's spare room on the 8th, the 9th, and the 12th. And the last one, the garage and the back bedroom, on the morning of the 15th. He said, I had a box of shop rags and extension cords, and I went up the 2 steps from May's garage into her kitchen, and I have gone up those steps 400 times, and the toe of my boot caught the lip." He said, "I got the phone out of my pocket on the floor, and I called Tessa. May made a small sound in the shade and put her hand over her mouth. That was the whole thing. That was the mystery I'd been working for 6 weeks with a highlighter and a county assessor's website. There was no scheme. There was no second family. No house nobody knew about, no sister moving pieces around a board. There was an 82-year-old cabinet maker trying to end something quietly enough that nobody would have to be ashamed in public, who fell down carrying a box of extension cords for a grandson who was not supposed to be there. Dad had Tessa open the box marked tools. Inside, in a wooden case with a sliding lid, wrapped in a piece of flannel, was the 62. He said, that one came back. $1,100 of my own money, and it came back. Then he looked at Evan, and he said, the other one didn't. And it isn't coming back, because it sold in May to somebody in another state, and it's gone. And I'd like to hear you say what happened to it." And my son, standing in the sun in front of his grandfather's oldest friend and his aunt and his mother, said, "I sold them both." He said, "The payouts came to $1,760. He said he'd meant to buy them back, that he'd looked at the case every week, that he was going to put them back on the shelves before anybody noticed, and that was the plan, that had always been the plan." Then he turned to me and said, "Mom, if you can cover the unit for another couple of months and help me make the tool right, I can fix all of this." I had known the question was coming since the moment I read the face sheet in that parking lot. I'd had 2 days to get ready for it, and I still had to hold on to the edge of the storage door, because I'd done it before. Not this size, but I'd done it. The car insurance in 2019. The deposit on the place off Chambers, which I never told a soul about. 300 here, 600 there, sent quietly, on a Tuesday, so that nothing would have to become a conversation. Every one of them the fastest way to make a bad feeling stop. I have written the words pattern of loss in claim files for 26 years. It never occurred to me to write it about my own kitchen table. I said no, not gently. I don't think you can say it gently. I said, I'm not paying for the unit, and I'm not replacing the plane, and I'm not going to be the reason this ends without you feeling it. Evan said my name like it was a mistake I was making. And I said the rest of it, out loud, in front of all of them, because it was mine to say. I said, 3 years ago I took a key off my father's board that wasn't mine to take, and I put it in your hand at midnight, and I never asked for it back, and then I told myself I'd handled it. I said, I did that. Nobody else. And every time after that, when something went sideways, I paid it down to quiet, and quiet is what let you sit in that woman's house 4 months past when you were welcome. I said, I'm not doing the quiet anymore. Then I told him what I would do, because refusing is not the same as leaving, and I'd spent a week making sure I knew the difference. My car every Saturday morning for as long as it takes. Applications at my kitchen table, and I'd read every one of them, because I have read paperwork for a living and I am good at it. A ride to the intake appointment at the housing program on Highway 99, which I had already called about, and which had a bed. And a repayment schedule. In writing. To his grandfather. Not to me. $50 a month against $1,760, which is 3 years, and I said the 3 years out loud so nobody could pretend it was symbolic. Evan said, so you're picking him. And I said, I'm picking the version of this where you don't have to be managed. He said that was a nice way to put it, and he wasn't wrong, and I let it stand. There's a kind of answer that sounds better than it feels, and I'd used one and he caught it. He is not a stupid man. That's most of what makes it hard. Dad said his piece then, and it was short. He said, "Your things are yours. Take them whenever you want them. The unit's paid through the 6th. I've put one more month on it, and after the 5th of August, I'm not renting it again." Evan asked about the keys. My father said no. He said, "Not to my house and not to May's. Not because of the money. Because you used a key after you knew." Evan stood there a second longer. Then he took his key ring out of his pocket and worked 2 keys off the split ring, the way you do, with your thumbnail badly, taking too long. One had a cardboard tag on it, gone soft at the corners. He set them on the folding chair's arm next to his grandfather's hand. They didn't open anything anymore. He knew that. He did it anyway. And I think that was the only part of the morning he chose for himself. Tessa held out the clipboard with the inventory on it, 3 pages, every box listed, and a line at the bottom. My son read it. He signed it. His handwriting is my father's handwriting, if you don't look too closely, which is a thing I noticed at the worst possible moment. He handed the clipboard back, and he walked to his car facing the exit, and he drove out past the gravel, and he did not say goodbye to anybody, and I stood there and let him. By the middle of July, the house had been made to fit him. The bed was downstairs. The hallway was clear. The rugs were up. And there's a ramp on the back steps that a friend of his from the church built in a weekend, and my father has opinions about the pitch of it, which he shares. May got her keys the second week he was home. He wouldn't mail them. She drove in from Bend, and he handed her a paper envelope at the kitchen table with both new keys in it. And he said the arrangement was finished. And she said, "Don't be ridiculous. Harold, come do my gutters in the fall." Her letter came back too. She'd wanted it back so it wouldn't be sitting in a drawer, meaning something after it stopped being true. Tessa and I have a rule now. We made it in her kitchen, over the same tea I didn't drink in June. The rule is that neither of us protects the other one from information. Not to be kind. Not to keep the peace. If Dad tells one of us something and asks her to hold it, she says out loud that she's holding something, and who asked her to, and she doesn't pretend the silence isn't there. That's it. That's the whole rule. It took our family 50 years and a broken hip to write it down. It isn't fixed between us. Some of what I said in that kitchen doesn't come back out of the air. But we talk on Sundays, and neither of us has to guess anymore. Evan took the bed on Highway 99. I drove him to the intake on a Tuesday. 25 minutes, and we talked about the transmission in his car and a ball game neither of us had watched. He had a folder on his knees with his birth certificate in it because they'd told him to bring it, and I recognized the folder. It was one of mine, from the house, from 100 years ago. At the door he said thanks for the ride. Not thanks for anything else. And he didn't ask for anything else. And I made myself get back in the car and pull out of the lot without watching him go in, because a person is allowed to walk into a building without his mother's face in the window. He moved his boxes out of Unit 117 on the 2nd of August with a friend's pickup, 3 days before the deadline. And I know because the storage office called Dad to say the unit was empty and swept. In the middle of August, an envelope came to Alder Street with a money order in it for $50. No note. Nothing about a key, nothing about coming by, nothing asking anyone to say it was all right. Just the money order, made out to Harold Mercer. Dad wrote the date and the amount on an index card and put it in the green metal box on the wall, in the front, ahead of the tools. He doesn't call my son. My son doesn't call me. There's a Saturday sometimes where the phone rings and there's a voice on it, and there's a Saturday where there isn't. I've stopped treating the quiet ones like a verdict. The last thing I want to tell you happened at his kitchen table, a few days after the storage unit. He had the 2 old keys in front of him. The ones from the doors that don't exist anymore, and 2 small envelopes, the kind you'd put a check in. He wrote on the first one in that block print, the M like a little sawhorse. Alder Street. Permission ended. May 7th. And on the second one, Juniper Lane, and the same 2 words, and the same date. He put 1 key in each, and licked them shut, and set them side by side in the drawer where he keeps his warranties. He didn't offer me either one. I'd like to be able to say I'd have refused, but the truth is he never gave me the chance, and I think he did that on purpose, and I think he was right. I put my coffee cup in his sink, and I said I'd see him Sunday. Then I let myself out the front door, and I pulled it until I heard the new lock catch, and I walked to my car with nothing in my hands.